Picture this incredibly hyper-specific, razor-sharp reality firmly planted in your mind's eye, deeply absorbing every single granular, atmospheric detail of the hyper-optimized, meticulously structured existence you have exhaustingly carved out for yourself over the last grueling, highly caffeinated decade and a half of relentless corporate warfare. You are exactly 37 years old, walking confidently through the bustling metropolitan landscape, armed with a top-tier, highly coveted Master of Business Administration degree from ITESM, an elite academic credential that you literally bled, sweat, and completely sacrificed the best years of your carefree youth to stubbornly obtain. You have spent the last 8 relentless, brutally demanding years of your professional life absolutely crushing it in the hyper-competitive, deeply cutthroat, endlessly stressful world of global supply chain management for a massive, multi-state commercial beverage distributor. You are the invisible, brilliant architect, the unsung quantitative hero working entirely behind the heavy corporate curtain, the analytical guy who has spent thousands upon thousands of highly caffeinated, sleep-deprived hours staring intensely at glowing dual monitors, relentlessly optimizing complex delivery routes down to the absolute microscopic microsecond. You are the legitimate logistical savant who aggressively, single-handedly slashed corporate transportation overhead by an astonishing 23% in a single fiscal year. A mathematical feat that had the C-suite executives practically worshipping the ground you walked on and throwing massive, life-altering quarterly bonuses your way. You are the operational mastermind who successfully designed and flawlessly implemented cutting-edge, highly proprietary digital inventory tracking systems that were so incredibly, undeniably effective, they practically became the absolute gold standard across the entire North American commercial freight logistics industry. You are undeniably, exceptionally, almost frighteningly good at what you do, possessing this rare, almost savant-like cognitive ability to make massive quantities of physical objects seamlessly move from point A to point B with a level of frictionless aerodynamic efficiency that genuinely borders on pure, unadulterated wizardry. You literally live and breathe the intricate, mind-bending, deeply mathematical puzzles of international logistics that everyday, average people never even waste a single, fleeting second thinking about when they casually pull an ice-cold, perfectly pristine drink out of a brightly lit convenience store refrigerator on a sweltering summer afternoon. Your entire waking life is rigidly defined by endless, complex Excel spreadsheets, highly advanced predictive algorithms, dynamic risk modeling, and the relentless, obsessive pursuit of total systemic operational optimization. Then, seemingly entirely out of the blue on a random, rainy Tuesday afternoon, you get a highly encrypted, deeply discreet digital message tapping you for a private, highly secretive meeting with a high-end, heavily connected corporate headhunter. You agree to officially meet him at a ridiculously expensive, dimly lit downtown mahogany steakhouse, and right off the bat, this guy is incredibly slick, wearing a bespoke, hand-tailored Italian suit that probably costs significantly more than your very first car. He leans intimately across the expensive table, cautiously lowers his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, and tells you that his ultra-exclusive, deeply private client is desperately, aggressively looking for someone with your exact, highly specialized, genius-level quantitative skill set to completely overhaul a massive, tightly guarded international import-export operation. The hook he casually throws on the table is absolutely staggering. The baseline starting salary they are officially offering for your highly specialized services is exactly 4 times what you are currently pulling down at the legitimate beverage gig, absolutely completely tax-free, plus massive performance-based quarterly bonuses that could easily, mathematically double that baseline number. The physical job description document he smoothly slides across the table to you is remarkably, almost deliberately, terrifyingly vague and completely open-ended. It explicitly mentions high-level international transportation coordination, massive-scale multinational inventory management, and aggressive dynamic route optimization, but it completely, intentionally leaves out any specific mention of the actual physical product you will be directly responsible for moving across highly, heavily guarded international borders. Looking back on that exact moment with the painful, agonizing clarity of hindsight, you know deep down in your gut that you absolutely should have aggressively pumped the brakes right then and there. You should have pushed back incredibly hard and asked 100 more probing, deeply uncomfortable questions. You should have seriously, deeply wondered why any completely legitimate, above-board corporate import-export business would ever rationally require that intense, paranoid, almost military-grade level of top-secret operational confidentiality just to move standard commercial freight around the North American continent. But your harsh, immediate reality at home was heavily, heavily tipping the scales in their favor. Your beautiful wife was heavily pregnant with your second child, constantly stressing about the wildly uncertain financial future. The massive mortgage on the gorgeous, sprawling dream house in the pristine, highly coveted suburban neighborhood you desperately wanted was just frustratingly, agonizingly out of your current financial reach. Staring down at a legally binding piece of paper offering literally 4 times your current 6-figure salary meant that you would absolutely never, ever have to lay awake at night stressing about money, college funds, or medical bills ever again in your natural life. It was the ultimate golden ticket, the absolute financial cheat code you had been aggressively grinding your entire life to finally find. So you take the massive, completely blind leap of faith. On your very first official day on the cartel payroll, they absolutely don't take you to a shiny, glass-paneled corporate high-rise in the downtown financial district. Instead, you are abruptly picked up in a heavily tinted, fully armored SUV and driven aggressively out to a massive, incredibly nondescript, brutally utilitarian industrial warehouse compound situated miles and miles outside the bustling, chaotic city limits of Guadalajara. The absolute moment the heavy, armored tires of the massive SUV crunch aggressively on the dusty gravel lot of the fortified compound, the fragile, comfortable illusion you had meticulously built in your mind starts to violently, brutally shatter into a million jagged, terrifying pieces. The sheer physical security presence aggressively surrounding this isolated, highly secure facility is vastly heavier, intensely more aggressive, and far more deeply intimidating than absolutely anything you have ever witnessed at the commercial beverage company, or frankly, any other legitimate corporate logistics hub on the face of the planet. The heavily armed men silently, methodically patrolling the massive concrete perimeter carry themselves with this hyper-alert, coiled spring, deeply predatory tension, their cold, dead eyes constantly scanning the hazy horizon, not for missing commercial delivery trucks, but for active, lethal, existential threats from heavily armed rival factions or federal authorities. When you finally, nervously, step inside the cavernous, dimly lit industrial building and lay your totally shocked eyes on the actual physical inventory you have been highly compensated to efficiently manage, your blood instantly, violently runs completely ice-cold in your veins. You absolutely aren't looking at neat wooden pallets of glass bottles, stacked aluminum cans, or shrink-wrapped consumer electronics. The massive, towering inventory stacked high above you consists of thousands of tightly packed, meticulously wrapped, and heavily vacuum-sealed packages. The sheer physical weight of these countless packages isn't measured in standard commercial shipping cases, gross tonnage, or standard freight units. It is meticulously, obsessively measured in raw, unadulterated, highly illegal kilos. In a fraction of a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the crushing, inescapable, completely suffocating reality of the situation hits you right in the chest like a runaway commercial freight train. You understand immediately, with crystal-clear, horrifying, completely mind-bending precision, exactly what kind of dark, deeply violent, multi-billion-dollar shadow organization you have just legally and physically agreed to aggressively work for. You also deeply understand, with that exact same terrifying, entirely paralyzing clarity, that realizing you are firmly, inescapably trapped in the belly of the beast after the heavy steel cage doors have already locked firmly behind you is a massive, highly life-altering, potentially fatal problem that simply does not have a clean, easy, or physically safe operational solution. They aggressively walk you into a stark, concrete back office, sit you down at a cheap metal desk, and they calmly offer you a choice, although the heavy, entirely unspoken, highly lethal threat lingering heavily in the dusty warehouse air makes it painfully, abundantly obvious that it isn't really a free choice at all. They calmly tell you, in a chillingly polite, strictly businesslike tone, that you can simply stand up, turn around, walk right out the front heavy security door right now, and absolutely nothing bad will ever physically happen to you or your young growing family. They strictly promise with incredibly cold, dead eyes that you can just completely, permanently wipe this entire geographical location from your memory, permanently forget the faces of the heavily armed men you have seen today, and go right back to your safe, predictable, aggressively normal, utterly boring suburban life, obsessively optimizing the movement of sugary sodas and fruit juices for the absolute rest of your natural life. Or, alternatively, you can actively choose to stay exactly right where you are. You can deeply, obsessively learn the intricate, massive scale of their highly illicit, highly complex, multi-billion-dollar operation, physically roll up your sleeves, and aggressively apply your genius-level, highly educated logistical skills to their very specific, incredibly high-stakes, heavily armed operational challenges. The massive, totally life-changing piles of cash they promised you at the downtown steakhouse are incredibly, undeniably, physically real. The sheer opportunity for totally unprecedented, completely unfettered professional autonomy to completely design a massive, multinational supply chain completely from scratch is entirely real. The terrifying, absolutely life and death physical risks are absolutely, undeniably real too, but your arrogant, highly educated, fiercely MBA-trained brain immediately, desperately starts heavily rationalizing the extreme danger, frantically convincing you that these lethal, bloody risks are entirely, mathematically manageable for a highly smart, deeply disciplined, totally logical guy who simply strictly keeps his head down, strictly stays in his designated corporate lane, and just simply does his damn job perfectly. So, you willingly make the ultimate, entirely irreversible devil's bargain. You choose to stay. You go back to your hotel that night, you look yourself dead in the mirror, and you skillfully, desperately spin yourself an incredibly comfortable, highly comforting, entirely fictional lie. You tell yourself, with absolute total conviction, that you will absolutely only do this insanely illegal, highly dangerous, totally terrifying work for exactly one single, strict calendar year. You strictly tell yourself you will aggressively stash away enough of this astronomical, totally illicit salary in highly hidden, deeply encrypted offshore accounts to completely fund a ridiculously comfortable, totally off-the-grid, highly luxurious early retirement, and that you will seamlessly, quietly, and perfectly bounce from the violent organization long before the inevitable, complex logistical complications cascade into a massive, catastrophic, entirely life-ending legal or physical disaster. What you absolutely don't realize in that brief, highly foolish moment of extreme hubris is that absolutely every single professional, highly educated person who has ever dipped their pristine toes into this dark, highly violent, deeply unforgiving underworld has stood in front of that exact same mirror and proudly told themselves that exact same, highly pathetic little fairy tale. And the cold, hard, undisputed historical truth is that absolutely none of them have ever, in the entire bloody history of the massive cartel, managed to successfully, permanently escape the inevitable, totally brutal, highly permanent ending that this dark life violently demands. Once you officially begin, your entire first month firmly on the cartel payroll is dedicated entirely to intense, obsessive, highly quiet observation. You make absolutely sure that you don't aggressively change a single, solitary thing about their daily, highly chaotic operations. You just sit quietly in the shadows, intensely watch the chaotic physical flow of illicit product, deeply learn the unspoken, highly violent rules, and actively act like a massive, highly analytical sponge, aggressively absorbing oceans of raw, unfiltered operational data. You painstakingly, meticulously map out absolutely every single one of their highly established, deeply historically entrenched smuggling routes, carefully tracking their highly erratic, entirely unpredictable delivery schedules, and aggressively zeroing in on the disastrous, incredibly expensive logistical choke points where millions of dollars of highly illicit, incredibly vulnerable product constantly backs up, sits completely exposed to heavily armed law enforcement, and where overall operational efficiency completely goes to die a slow, miserable, highly unprofitable death. You actively take out your pristine, oversized whiteboards and meticulously boot up your complex, highly expensive predictive digital mapping software, and you highly meticulously chart out this entire deeply illegal, sprawling international empire exactly the same rigorous, highly academic way you would aggressively map out a standard corporate supply chain for a completely legitimate, massive Fortune 500 tech company. You aggressively, systematically hunt down absolutely every single glaring instance of wasted physical transport time, massive financial redundancy, and sloppy, highly amateurish operational overlap, actively pinpointing the highly specific, entirely overlooked, heavily vulnerable nodes in the massive North American transport network where aggressively implementing even incredibly small, mathematically sound systemic changes could organically, undeniably yield absolutely massive, game-changing statistical improvements in total transit speed, overall operational safety, and pure, absolute bottom-line profitability. To your highly trained, deeply analytical, hyper-focused brain, the daily, highly grueling logistical work actually feels incredibly, soothingly, almost dangerously familiar. Yes, you logically, entirely know the physical, heavy, vacuum-sealed product you are obsessively tracking is highly illegal, deeply socially destructive, and incredibly dangerous. But at the absolute end of the workday, basic logistics is simply basic logistics. The highly cold, totally unfeeling, perfectly rational math of global commercial supply chain management simply does not actively care what kind of physical object you are actually physically moving from one specific geographical GPS coordinate to another. The sterile numbers absolutely don't carry any heavy moral weight. Once you have successfully, entirely parsed all the massive, deeply overwhelming amounts of raw operational data, you confidently, smoothly stride into a highly secure, entirely sweep-tested underground boardroom and officially present your very first, incredibly comprehensive, heavily data-backed operational optimization proposal to the absolute terrifying top-tier cartel bosses at the absolute end of month 3. Standing confidently in front of these incredibly dangerous, heavily armed men, you clearly lay out a brilliant, highly aggressive, heavily data-backed plan for massive logistical route consolidation that your highly complex predictive statistical models mathematically guarantee will instantly, undeniably, reduce overall physical transport transit time by a massive, game-changing 18%. You clearly, logically, and mathematically show them exactly how to systematically, permanently eliminate entirely redundant physical transport legs and safely, securely combine massive, multi-million-dollar physical shipments that are currently, foolishly traveling completely separately through the exact same highly monitored, totally high-risk highway corridors. You actively introduce the brilliant, entirely corporate concept of highly strategic inventory staging, carefully explaining how this simple logistical shift will totally eliminate the terrifying, highly vulnerable physical bottlenecks at the heavily guarded, massive international border crossings by carefully, mathematically pre-positioning massive quantities of illicit product in highly hidden staging zones so that the massive freight only actually physically moves through the federal law enforcement checkpoints during highly specific, statistically optimal timing windows, when shift guard rotations and massive heavy commercial traffic volume naturally create massive, entirely exploitable operational blind spots. You confidently, smoothly pitch a highly comprehensive, heavily centralized digital tracking and scheduling system that seamlessly, flawlessly coordinates hundreds of simultaneous operational pickups and final deliveries across the entire massive North American geographical distribution network, entirely and permanently replacing their highly chaotic, entirely fragmented old system that basically left absolutely every single isolated, deeply stressed out regional manager to just wildly figure things out entirely independently by the seat of their pants. You mathematically, totally promise them, pointing aggressively directly at the hard statistical data, that under your pristine, highly complex new system, there will be absolutely no more incredibly expensive commercial transport trucks sitting completely empty, burning highly expensive fuel, and completely highly exposed while illicit product idly gathers dust in highly vulnerable staging warehouses, and absolutely no more panicked, highly rushed, completely disorganized physical shipments that mathematically create massive physical security vulnerabilities and practically invite unwanted, highly aggressive federal law enforcement attention. As you passionately, intensely speak, fully in your absolute corporate element, you suddenly genuinely realize that the high-level, terrifying cartel leadership is actively listening to you with absolutely zero emotional expression on their deeply hardened faces. It is a totally terrifying, utterly blank slate, highly predatory intensity. But in that exact highly charged moment, a massive, total paradigm-shifting realization forcefully hits you. These totally terrifying, incredibly heavily armed men are actual, highly intelligent, deeply analytical corporate businessmen. They are absolutely not the highly erratic, wildly wild-eyed, highly impulsive, constantly trigger-happy cartoon killers that lazy Hollywood movies constantly portray them as. They are cold, deeply calculating, incredibly sharp corporate-minded executives who deeply, intrinsically, and fundamentally totally understand the absolute, undeniable, massive value of high profit margins, massive operational risk mitigation, and total logistical efficiency. When you finally proudly finish your highly polished, flawless pitch, they immediately start aggressively, intensely grilling you, asking incredibly sharp, highly technical, deeply complex mathematical logistical questions that totally mathematically prove they completely, perfectly understand exactly what you are mathematically proposing to aggressively do. They aggressively, ruthlessly probe for structural statistical weaknesses in your highly complex predictive data models, and they ruthlessly, entirely challenge your absolute baseline statistical assumptions. And then, once you successfully, highly confidently defend your complex logistical thesis with hard, undeniable numbers, they unequivocally, entirely approve absolutely everything you aggressively asked for, casually handing you a massive, practically unlimited, totally untraceable operational budget, and absolutely all the terrifying, highly lethal human resources you could ever possibly physically need to fully implement your grand, deeply optimized mathematical vision. By the time you officially hit the highly anticipated end of year one, the actual totally mathematical results of your obsessive work are undeniably incredibly staggering. Your highly newly implemented, highly advanced digital tracking and physical routing systems have single-handedly massively increased the entire organization's total illicit product throughput by a totally mind-blowing, entirely unprecedented 30%. You have completely, fundamentally, entirely revolutionized the structural way this massive, sprawling criminal empire physically, actively operates. The entire sprawling organization is now highly aggressively moving significantly more highly lucrative illicit product while mathematically utilizing vastly fewer actual physical operational resources, massively reducing their total federal law enforcement exposure by aggressively, systematically consolidating entirely redundant, sloppy shipments, and completely, permanently avoiding the highly amateurish logistical inefficiencies that previously created huge, totally unnecessary physical, operational vulnerabilities. Mathematically speaking, actively utilizing significantly fewer massive commercial transport trucks on the open highway directly means significantly fewer statistical mathematical chances for highly aggressive government interdiction and random, highly dangerous commercial searches. Implementing a vastly superior, entirely tighter digital scheduling algorithm mathematically guarantees significantly less highly illegal product is just sitting entirely idle in highly vulnerable, entirely stationary stash houses where highly sudden, totally violent law enforcement raids can easily discover it. Utilizing vastly smarter, heavily predictive data-driven routing software directly ensures that massive, totally multi-million-dollar physical shipments strictly arrive exactly when they are mathematically, highly explicitly expected, absolutely not a single minute early, and absolutely not a single minute late, moving continuously in highly smooth, heavily randomized, mathematically totally perfect logistical patterns that absolutely never trigger the suspicion of highly seasoned highway patrolmen or deeply trained federal border agents. Without even fully, entirely consciously realizing the immense, terrifying gravity of what is actively happening to your life, you have actively become incredibly, highly dangerously, totally valuable to these highly ruthless, totally violent men in deeply complex ways you absolutely never actually anticipated when you first blindly took the job. You are absolutely no longer just the nerdy, highly quiet corporate supply chain optimizer sitting comfortably in the isolated corner office. You have organically, entirely aggressively evolved into their absolute primary, highly trusted, go-to operational and strategic problem solver. You are literally, undeniably, the absolute only guy in the entire corporate, heavily guarded room who heavily thinks systematically, entirely rationally, and strictly mathematically about massive, highly complex logistical challenges that absolutely everyone else in the deeply violent organization historically heavily approached, with totally raw, wildly unpredictable intuition and extreme, totally blunt force physical violence. Now, when a massive, highly lucrative international smuggling route inevitably gets severely, entirely compromised by highly aggressive federal law enforcement, the absolute top-tier, highly secretive cartel leadership actually deeply calls your highly encrypted, totally untraceable burner phone aggressively seeking your massive data analysis before they even remotely think about heavily calling in the heavily armed sicarios to handle it physically. When a highly lucrative, entirely new, totally highly contested geographical territory forcefully, violently opens up in the massive market, they absolutely demand your highly comprehensive, deeply detailed data analysis and highly complex logistical financial projections before they even highly consider committing millions of dollars in resources and heavily armed manpower to actively claim it. You have effectively, entirely, completely become the totally irreplaceable, highly physically protected brain trust, the brilliant, highly logical, totally cold central processor for a massive, heavily violent, multi-billion-dollar criminal organization that previously just ran purely on highly unadulterated instinct and completely raw, totally paralyzing fear. And as your massive, totally undeniable financial value to the terrifying organization absolutely skyrockets, the highly laundered, entirely illicit money heavily flows entirely into your carefully hidden offshore bank accounts, totally transforming your life. As the massive, entirely untraceable illicit funds continuously flood your highly hidden accounts, the deeply terrifying, totally undeniable reality of your highly lucrative, totally dark situation is that your brilliant, perfectly executed logistical work is directly, highly efficiently, entirely enabling the massive, totally uninterrupted delivery of highly addictive, entirely lethal poison to literally millions of deeply desperate, highly vulnerable people completely across the entire North American continent. The extreme, highly totally suffocating cognitive dissonance fundamentally required to completely mentally survive this highly dark, totally undeniable reality rapidly, entirely becomes its own highly specialized, deeply essential psychological survival skill. You actively, highly forcefully, entirely train your highly educated brain to absolutely only deeply think about the massive, deeply violent, multi-billion-dollar drug smuggling operation purely, entirely as a highly complex intellectual mathematical abstraction. You aggressively view it strictly, entirely as a complex, deeply fascinating series of totally bloodless logistical problems waiting to be brilliantly, systematically solved by your massive intellect, entirely and completely purposefully stripping away any and absolutely all reference to their deeply devastating, entirely horrific real-world human implications. But the deeply protective, entirely artificial psychological facade you meticulously built is slowly, completely, totally cracking under the immense, totally highly suffocating psychological weight of your actions. By the time year 4 completely entirely rolls around, your entire existence is suddenly thrown entirely into absolute total operational chaos. A highly aggressive, incredibly heavily armed rival competitor cartel organization explicitly, violently targets your perfectly, highly carefully optimized, sprawling logistics network. They entirely start heavily launching massive, highly coordinated, deeply violent physical highway attacks, hijacking your highly optimized, totally multi-million-dollar commercial shipments completely on the open interstate highway and brutally, entirely murdering your highly trained, deeply highly vetted transport drivers entirely in totally broad daylight. The absolute terrifying top bosses abruptly turn entirely to you and coldly, heavily ask you to logically, systematically, entirely solve this horrific, highly violent problem too strictly with your massive digital spreadsheets. But an entirely worse, vastly more totally terrifying problem suddenly violently emerges from the total hidden shadows of the organization. A massive, totally highly coordinated, highly aggressive multi-agency DEA federal investigation gets dangerously, highly suffocatingly close to the absolute secretive inner circle. The totally paranoid leadership instantly heavily realizes that someone highly placed deeply within the massive organization is actively, entirely, loudly talking, secretly, completely highly feeding, incredibly highly damaging, deeply classified, operational tracking digital information entirely directly to American federal agents. The terrifying, highly violent bosses violently demand that you aggressively totally use your massive, total digital data server access to perfectly, mathematically, deeply help them immediately totally identify the highly placed human leak. They coldly, entirely ruthlessly order you to ruthlessly, systematically highly analyze massive internal digital communication patterns, aggressively completely audit deeply classified, highly secure server access logs, and meticulously, perfectly totally follow the massive, highly complex digital data trail that might logically, absolutely mathematically reveal exactly who is actively, entirely completely betraying the massive organization to the feds. And God completely highly help your deeply permanently broken soul, you actually entirely mechanically do it. You build totally highly complex, highly predictive, statistical digital behavioral models that perfectly, highly, entirely accurately flag deeply, highly suspicious digital server behavior. You entirely, highly isolate, highly glaring mathematical anomalies completely, entirely in the massive internal communication digital network. You mathematically, entirely perfectly identify the totally specific, entirely tiny handful of exact corporate people whose internal digital footprints mathematically entirely make them statistically the absolute most highly entirely likely candidates to be the massive federal informants. You physically print out your deeply highly damning, totally perfectly formatted statistical analysis, put it entirely carefully in a pristine manila folder, and you physically, quietly, deeply hand it totally entirely over to highly terrifying, deeply violently dangerous men who you absolutely, entirely, totally know will aggressively use your neat, entirely perfect little spreadsheets to violently, entirely hunt down and permanently, brutally, completely eliminate the human mathematical threats. A few totally terrifying, deeply quiet days later, the deeply terrified informant is finally, completely, totally found. It entirely completely turns out to be a quiet, highly entirely friendly, mid-level logistics warehouse supply manager that you had personally, entirely deeply worked highly closely with on several massive network operational optimization projects. He was entirely totally a deeply devoted, highly caring family man with two very young, totally innocent children who were the exact same age as your own highly young kids. You absolutely totally don't ever actively see what horrific, highly, entirely violent things they actually entirely completely do to him in the dark. You just walk entirely completely into the massive logistics distribution hub one totally bright sunny morning and actively, immediately clearly notice his highly sudden, total entirely permanent physical absence from his desk. Your entirely totally brilliant, deeply completely perfect data analysis completely directly entirely made that sudden total absence physically entirely possible. Your deeply, totally elegant, highly formatted, color-coded Excel spreadsheet literally, entirely completely became a deeply brutal, entirely totally permanent, bloody execution warrant. The massive, deeply totally protective psychological wall you spent heavily, highly years, carefully, entirely meticulously building in your highly stressed mind has entirely, spectacularly, completely, violently crumbled entirely completely into total dust. You begin heavily, highly intentionally, making extremely highly totally subtle, deeply entirely uncharacteristic mathematical digital mistakes. You intentionally, totally, completely design highly subtle, entirely hidden logistical oversights that absolutely only someone paying incredibly, highly, entirely close, expert-level total attention to the highly raw data might ever possibly, entirely, completely notice. This continuous, highly, completely low-level logistical total sabotage is incredibly, totally, completely subtle, deeply, entirely, totally unconscious, and almost completely entirely feels like your highly completely traumatized mind is violently, deeply entirely, desperately rebelling entirely completely against the completely entirely horrific things that your physical hands are actively totally typing on the mechanical keyboard entirely completely every single day. The paranoid, highly aggressive leadership entirely completely notices the totally slight dip in perfection, and they entirely completely start highly watching your highly complex daily work deeply, totally closely. Your highly completely traumatized wife finally entirely completely takes the young kids and entirely completely leaves the sprawling mansion permanently. Then, the American federal authorities completely totally execute a massive, highly entirely coordinated border bust and successfully entirely completely arrest 3 of your top-tier transport drivers during a highly massive, totally aggressive stop in Texas. The highly terrified drivers entirely completely know your massive, highly proprietary systems perfectly. You completely totally panic and entirely completely run, frantically hiding deeply completely in a highly rural, totally impoverished Mexican roadside motel. But the massive cartel entirely, quickly completely finds you. They totally completely bring you entirely back to the massive corporate office, highly completely polite, highly deeply entirely terrifying. And then, the highly totally eager new Spanish corporate MBA entirely completely arrives to completely, highly aggressively totally shadow you. You instantly, totally, completely, clearly realize you are actively, deeply, entirely being highly, systematically, completely harvested for absolutely all your highly complex total knowledge before they entirely, permanently, completely eliminate you. You frantically, completely, totally build a massive, highly, completely encrypted dead man's switch, highly deep in the digital cloud, highly, entirely, desperately trying to completely, totally create massive, highly, entirely necessary digital leverage to entirely, completely survive. You have brilliantly, totally, completely optimized a sprawling, entirely beautiful supply chain that perfectly, entirely, completely delivers massive total destruction, and you entirely, finally, completely, totally realize that the massive, deeply, totally violent machine never entirely, completely needed you. It only completely, totally used you up.